I'm a small axe, you're a small axe, and this is a small axe. Thank you so much for joining me. I am excited to think along with you and be in conversation with, I don't know, whoever is, whoever feels happy to come and listen. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for thinking along with me. All right, so recently I've been thinking particularly about the early 2000s, and of course the people at the center of my memory are usually Caribbean people. And so specifically thinking about Jamaica and the early 2000s. And although I hesitate to describe the early 2000s as a point in history, I don't know if I don't think scholars at all are considering that point in time a moment in history. Like, I think maybe people who work within the discipline of anthropology are probably more compelled to explore ideas from that particular moment in time. So today we're going to be thinking particularly about Bashment Granny, right? Bashment Granny, the economic blueprint of the Caribbean romance scam, which, will be my own cultural critique and just ideas and things that kind of I'm curious about. So it's 2008 and the entire world is in the thick of the global recession. The last time the global economy experienced something comparable was the Great Depression. Bruce Golding had been prime minister for over a year, and the future wasn't necessarily looking bright. As Dominican Republic's President Leonel Fernandez estimated, it would take about 10 to 15 years for Latin America and the Caribbean to recover from the recession. According to the late Dr. Budin, former professor of economics at the University of the West Indies, said that the Jamaican government should ask President-elect Barack Obama to extend temporary protected status to Jamaica and the Caribbean. In my opinion, President-elect Barack Obama's Hope campaign was definitely doing a lot of lifting for a lot of people. Dr. Budin argued, though, that Jamaica's economic output / economy should widen as tourism was and still is Jamaica's most lucrative product. He argued that the government's policies should be reflective of the deeply entrenched inequities in Jamaica, which can be addressed through supporting Jamaican children. Supporting youth in his and the United Nations perspective has the potential to change the landscape of the average Jamaican's quality of life. However, in 2008, those aspirations were obviously not achieved, and compounding intersections of marginality made it difficult for the average Jamaican to navigate. Entertainment, however, continued to grow, as does all Black art, right? For those of us in the diaspora, however, the sights and sounds of Caribbean entertainment created a small window into the sights and sounds mostly reflective and representative of marginalized people, specifically African Caribbean Jamaicans. And of course, this is not limited to them, but this is the group of people that are predominantly represented visually in these spaces. Visual culture production in the late 20th century and early 21st century was and still is dominated by Black, usually lower class Jamaicans, which mirrored their experiences. A cultural marker for this unique period, at least for myself, would be Bashment Granny. Bashment Granny takes place in urban downtown Kingston, and there we find an impoverished father, Mr. Bashment, and his son, Juki the pilot. Mr. Bashment's other son, Bad Boy Trevor, comes to town and brings a clown car of chaos to his father's home. And in my opinion, Bad Boy Trevor is a representation of the economic anxiety and aspirations of Black men under the pressure cooker of the global and economic turbulence at the time. Informed by his economic status, Trevor uses his charm to manipulate women across the spectrum of class and age. He brings agency to the predatory idea of, quote, Stella getting her groove back. And for people who are like a part of Gen X's generation, they're probably more familiar with that particular cultural African-American touch point. Informed by his economic status, Trevor uses his charm to manipulate women across the spectrum of class and age. He brings agency to the predatory idea of Stella getting her groove back and that Black young men in the global South are just vessels for sex work. Stella, for the purpose of this discussion, describes particularly older women, specifically Black women from the global North, who might have access to capital but not necessarily a partner. And I just want to state for the record that this is not a bad thing. This is just a thing that exists. And, there are people who have this particular experience, and that's okay. So these women are not interested in their young partners having similar class status. They're interested in pursuing these men for access to sex and possibly a very power imbalanced partnership that is skewed toward the partner with the most class access. In Trevor's case, an older Jamaican English woman by the name of Miss P functions as his Stella. Miss P and many like herself were born in Jamaica and moved to the global North. Miss P, in this particular play, spent 30 years living abroad, and the distance in space and time created the perfect environment for distant and foggy familiarity with her home island, which was exploited by utilizing her desire for partnership. Unbeknownst to Miss P, she becomes the vehicle that could potentially raise the class status of Trevor and by extension his family and partner through his version of a romance scam, which I know many people are kind of familiar with in terms of thinking about the idea of scamming and even that particular facet of the underground economy becoming a very mainstream topic of conversation. Miss P's desire for partnership makes her malleable to manipulation. And what does it mean to be lonely enough to be this malleable / at risk for financial indentured servitude, right? I argue that Bashment Granny is indeed a classic in the, this is a big claim, big claim. And please, if you disagree, let me know. I argue that Bashment Granny is indeed a classic in the literary canon of Y2K Jamaican visual culture production. Similar to Lady Saw's Striptease album, you had to embody a specific class status or to be in the know and have access to some of these spaces. This specific class register worked alongside video like dancehall culture. And this, like I think of, for example, Bogle, dancehall queen Renee 630. Like there's just a particular like a group of individuals that comes to mind when thinking about visual cultural production in this moment. So Bashment Granny is both an island side and diaspora facing African Jamaican cultural product. Bashment Granny captures the precarity of the global recession and the role of the Jamaican diaspora in easing the pressure that, the economic downturn Bashment Granny captures the precarity of the global recession and the role of the Jamaican diaspora in easing the pressure of the economic downturn by turning toward the diaspora to relieve that tension. Bashment Granny also captures clearly the deeply ingrained anti-blackness, colorist, classist, homophobic, and transphobic ideas that have survived beyond the colonial era and the system of enslavement. It's also a classic in the sense that it was the first time in my living memory that we see a visibly genderqueer person exist as a fundamental component of visual cultural production in Jamaica. So while Shabada's character functioned as, comic relief in the play, it was clear that Shabada was indeed the breakout star. During the curtain call at the conclusion of our play, Shabada receives a rupture of cheers louder than any cast member on stage. And I'm curious, I wonder what that feeling was for Shabada and how did it feel to know how well you were received at that time? So Shabada has since become widely known, particularly within obviously the Caribbean comedy space, and particularly in plays, which include but are not limited to The Driver, Shabada Comes to Town, Like Father Like Son, and of course like the sequel for Bashment Granny. So Shabada has cemented their career as an actor since Bashment Granny. And, Shabada's body gives us glimpses of the interstices that preclude acts of violence against genderqueer people, and especially during interactions with the police. Shabada also stands at a distance away with critiques and observations of heteronormativity, almost as if they're narrating the absurdity of heteronormative behaviors, and in one instance acknowledges the ways in which they benefit from the system of patriarchy, or as their character describes, man government. An equalizing moment that unifies both Shabada's character and Bad Boy Trevor's love interest was Angel. So as sexual and gendered minorities, their run-in with the police was very interesting. So in one particular scene, Angel and Shabada are both in Mr. Bashment's home when the officer barges in and demands to search everybody. So the officer proceeds to harass Angel or sexually harass Angel by dry humping this woman. And the ways that we get to see the consistent glimpses of sexism in this play is particularly through how the characters treat her body throughout the entire text. So we'll return to the police officer in a moment. So Angel is a young, highly desirable woman who functions as Trevor's demonstration of power. Angel clearly has agency and power, but it's flat and limited. In our first introduction of her, Trevor says, "Meet Miguel." She didn't have a name. And she's completely silent for the vast majority of that particular interaction. And the men in the scene, they don't care to know what her name is. And as the viewer in the audience, you kind of are also there bearing witness to the fact that this person is being objectified, right? Like, she is an object for the audience member and also for the male characters in the text. So the objectification of women continue to be a theme throughout the text, and alongside that was the omnipresent force of anti-Blackness and colorism. So in one scene, Shabata visits Mr. Bashment, and Mr. Bashment kind of leans over and, just to kind of get a better look of Shabata's face. And Mr. Bashment calls direct attention to, Shabata's body modification. So, he goes, "Mirated, Shabata, I bleach." So Shabata shoots back, "You have a problem with that? If you did a bleach, your co-skin would have looked good." Which essentially, we kind of see the ways in which, the taboo thing of, at that particular time, engaging in this particular body modification was very taboo. Like, it wasn't necessarily something that people talked about. And even the language that we utilize to talk about this particular form of body modification, for some people kind of falls within the language of, like, you're cooling down your skin tone, you're cooling down. So at our first introduction of Shabata, we meet them as someone who engages in this particular practice in their beauty regimen, which is specifically skin lightening. So it's clear that this was conveyed, I think, like as well as you can, I think, in a play. Like, in order for this to even be visually, or in order for this to be a visual component of our experience, they use a foundation that was a couple shades lighter in order for folks to kind of get the picture. And to me, I felt like it was not a form of representation that felt cartoonish. And the reason why I say a form of representation is because, there are indeed people in our communities that do engage in this practice, and not just people within our communities that are far away that we don't know and we can't see and we can't touch, but more so like people who we love, who are in our immediate kin and communities that we love and care for, that do engage in this practice. And so it was nice to kind of see them, explored, and also seeing these people as people with agency, because a lot of times I think that people assume that if people are engaging in a form of particularly skin lightening as their form of body modification, that they indeed are somehow deeply wounded and deeply broken, when in fact it's more so just a conversation about, who we are as a society and the ways in which we treat, people who live in darker bodies. So yeah, I say all that to say that it was just really nice to see someone humanized with this particular experience. So within 1 minute of that particular scene, we get a very deeply colored scene that comes right after it, particularly when Mr. Bashment introduces both siblings, which would be Juki, the pilot, and Trevor, bad boy Trevor. So Mr. Bashment goes ahead and starts, Juki, meet your other brother, right? Juki and the entire audience chime in as if they're singing an ode to society's contempt for dark-skinned people. Oh no, he could never be my brother. The looks at him in my midnight, I am daylight. And of course, when consuming this like art, it's like, especially like visual and audio media, there's a way in which you're able to specifically point blame at like one particular artist or like, you know, their immediate colleagues. But especially when like a very colorist remark is made or something visually colorist is happening, right? Like, yeah. The eruption of laughter and chorus of colorism was and wasn't surprising to bear witness to. Oftentimes when consuming art, but especially visual and audio media, if a colorist reference is indeed made, there's usually a singular artist and their colleagues that can be cited as the perpetrators of that particular form of violence. However, the agreement that we see in this particular live taping of Bashment Granny was like jarring because it demonstrates, or yeah, because there's a particular agreement that happened with the audience and the people in the play, almost as if there is, or not almost as if, it demonstrates the wide net of responsibility that we all bear in order to eradicate the system of colorism within our communities and in our culture at large, right? Like, it's not shocking that a whole bunch of people in the audience were also kikiing and saying this word for word and thought that this was indeed really, really funny, because that means that we as a society have a lot to unpack in terms of how we think of dark-skinned people, the way we treat them in the many spaces in which they exist, and most importantly, how we treat ourselves and the measuring stick that we are using in order to, you know, humanize ourselves or humanize particular people and dehumanize others. So yeah. And, you know, colorism, and especially this form of colorism, was just, or the fundamental normalization of colorism and anti-Blackness was exactly what I remembered, reinforced in just so many ways. Whether we're talking about like cultural production, or we're talking about just interpersonal like experiences in the world, being, you know, among and around Caribbean people, the colorism was very thick in the air, especially during the early 2000s. I feel like now conversations around colorism have kind of like brought to our attention the ways in which we do have to center and remember the ways in which anti-Blackness was indeed an important component of control in the Caribbean. You know, I think now that we are continuing to have more of those conversations, we're a bit more aware of the violence that kind of is attached to these particular jokes and how we think of Black people. And big up to the Rastafarians, because I argue that Rastafarian people like literally are our own civil rights heroes. Like, they have been at the helm, they and other marginalized people, yeah, have been at the center of our conversations around social justice, particularly in the Caribbean. So big up to them. Their work is deeply important, and I am so grateful for just the important work that they've done in the world. So that was my tangent on that. So going back to thinking about, you know, just Bashment Granny and the very just all the little forms of anti-blackness that are shown throughout the play. What's also interesting for me is like the fact that Garfield Reed, who is the writer of the play, is in fact a dark-skinned Black man. So I wonder, particularly for him, what was the decision that he made in order to keep these jokes in, and who did he directly want to speak for, and who exactly did he want to speak to? So the economic precarity of the average Jamaican and the state. So we finally return to the police officer, who serves as a metaphor for the social temperature on the island. So what ideas and acts of violence are we as a society willing to delegate off to the foot soldiers of our colonial past, right? How accessible is violence for them, and who in our society costs the least? And how accessible is violence for them, and who in our society costs the least and are therefore the easiest to look away from when their rights are being violated? As I have previously stated, to me, this is the first time that we see a visibly queer, gender, non-conforming character. And alongside that, we witness the state violence attached to their compounding marginality. Hey, Bashi, you no obligation to no boy. Ewa, lock your eye, me I go shoot him. Mr. Bashment and Shibata cry out, no! Mr. Bashment responds, oh, if you gonna do that, yeah, idiot. Bashi, you don't see the boy back gun off of we? Shibata and Mr. Bashment look puzzled and start looking for the alleged gun, right? So Shibata and Mr. Bashment protest, no, and start looking for the alleged gun. Hey, Bashi, we could have shoot him and say I shoot out, you know? Shibata and Mr. Bashment protest, no, officer. So that's when Shibata jumps in. No, officer, shoot me. Shoot me, officer, shoot me. Shibata proceeds to take off his shirt, do the worm, and back up his behind toward the officer. Now, this seems to be done in a way to relieve the tension that we, clearly see as a violation of a clearly Black, gender non-conforming person, which is clearly a regular occurrence, particularly for people who exist at a lower socio-political and economic status in urban areas in Jamaica. So I think one of the most extreme examples of this was indeed the Tivoli Gardens incursion, where 68 civilians died through state violence, which happened under the same Bruce Golding administration in 2012. So our story ends with bad boy Trevor getting caught because his love interest was actually a secret FBI agent. Ooh, plot twist. And overall, Bashment Granny was a hit. And as of 2024, it has over 1.2 million views on YouTube. Sunika Wright, 9427, said, I can never get enough of when Shibata said, hey girl, dismiss your shape. And Tina Reed, 2849, wrote, 2023, and I still laugh every time I watch this. And I too had a great time watching this piece. And I feel like for me, it was a way for me to relive a really important part of my childhood, despite the unsettled social, economic, and political world that we lived in 2008. And of course, I think that's also just like the functionality of childhood, and even like why people gravitate so much to literature and, this form of cultural production, because the violence of the world is still ongoing. And we still need to, unfortunately, keep on living. So Bashment Granny for me had said many of the quiet parts out loud, and I'm grateful. So thank you for thinking with me. If there's anything else that you thought of, or maybe you revisited this play recently, please tell me what some of your thoughts are below, and I look forward to seeing you next time. I'm a small axe, you're a small axe, and this is a small axe. Bye.